Well, the cat is out of the bag, and people internationally are finally realizing that Canada is in financial trouble. We are going broke, and it is all due to Trudeau, the liberal policies, everything coming out of his cabinet. We are going to talk about that today and how much that has impacted us and the damage that is going to cause for us moving forward, even once Pierre takes over, because of course it does look like he is going to win. And speaking of that, we do have some good news coming out of Pierre's camp. I'm going to lead off with that video because he finally said some really interesting things, and then we will get into how we are going broke. Let's get into it.
Staying with the theme of bringing home our jobs, the unemployment rate for young people aged 15 to 24 has jumped in the past year from 10.6% to 13.5%. That's nearly an increase of 3% in just 1 year. There are 422,000 young people unemployed. And yet the
3% when it comes to unemployment is a staggering amount. It doesn't sound like a lot because you just say, it's 3%. Like, 3% of $100 is $3. But when you're talking unemployment numbers, 3% is huge.
Trudeau Liberals have brought in more than 750,000 temporary workers. And these workers are taking the jobs that normally young Canadians would start out with, fast food jobs, convenience store jobs, etc. Why are we bringing in cheap foreign workers to undercut young Canadians just so that massive corporations like Tim Hortons can save a few bucks an hour? And what would a Conservative government do to reverse this trend?
Thank you very much. Look, Trudeau's destroyed our entire immigration system, and he has expanded the temporary foreign worker program by well over 200% at a time when we're losing jobs.
Now that's a percent I don't have to explain as being a big deal. 200% increase.
When I was responsible for that program in 2015, we had only 60,000 temporary foreign workers. Now it's close to 200,000. And on top of that, you have international students who are effectively temporary foreign workers that came under the wrong stream.
Yes, and that was such a big takeaway for PP to talk about in this video, because the international students was a bit of a trending story. And then, of course, this LMIA has been a huge trending story and all these things. But the LMIA is just one factor. The international students, like we've talked about in other videos, they are just part of the LMIAs because they just don't fall under it because they graduate from their program as fast as possible. Most of them don't even go to school. They're working the entire time, and they are being used for the exact same purpose as the LMIA. The only people who are winning, though, of course, are the colleges who have been scamming these international people and the corporations which get the low-wage workers.
Our temporary foreign worker program should only be available to fill jobs that employers have proven beyond a doubt cannot be filled by Canadians. It should never be used to bring in low-wage workers from poor countries to take jobs away from or suppress the wages of Canadian workers. I challenge Canadian business to hire Canadian workers first, and I challenge the government to end the chaos in the temporary foreign worker program, bring the numbers down, and allow Canadians to get good, solid paying jobs that will give them enough money to buy an affordable home and food in safe neighborhoods. Thank you.
If a boomer is in the comments saying, like, young people don't want to work today, you can't hire any Canadians, what changed then? What changed? If people don't want to work and you can't hire anybody, tell me what changed. Don't just say this, because guess what? You can go back 100 years and find newspaper articles for the last 100 years of every generation saying the young generation doesn't work. You can't hire any good help anymore. It's this trend that's always happened through the entire history of Canada and the United States. Oh, we just can't. There's not enough bodies. There's not enough bodies. We can't find people. Well, why is McDonald's that much busier? Why is KFC that much busier? And the reason I use those as examples is, like, he's talking about how this is about wage suppression, because if you remember, guys, we talked about this LMIA map. I didn't know this, but there's a whole nother tab here. If you guys go to this website, comment down below if you guys checked out this website after I posted it. And we can see all of the companies who were not in compliance, which is big because a lot of them are, of course, Indian names like Rajvinder Sandhu. How is Freshie if you guys know the restaurant Freshie, how are they requiring LMIAs and international workers? A bunch of these infractions, which are hilarious, are like, oh yeah, the job listing didn't match the pay. So like we said, oh, we're going to cut down on the low wage workers. They can list whatever wage they want on the stupid thing. But then when they show up, like, hey, we just audited your program. You said you were going to be paying $28. You're paying this person $17. That's quite the discount. And so we're seeing that. And like Pizza Moretti. Like, does Pizza really need temporary foreign workers? Or is it because they're internationally owned and they know they can bring people over and they can charge them for the LMIAs? And again, the only people who wins are corporations because Canadians lose out. This is a bad thing bringing this many people. And then, of course, the people involved who come over and pay to work a minimum wage job that they're probably told they're getting a higher wage for are getting absolutely screwed over. This video right here I found interesting because it is a British channel talking about how much Canada is getting smoked right now economically. And I actually think they talked about the immigration and a bunch of other things. It was a good watch. Let's get into it.
For most of the past 15 years, Canada's economy has been the envy of much of the developed world. Canada weathered the 2008 financial crash perhaps better than any other developed country, and its impressive GDP, stable, progressive politics, and general good vibes meant that it was widely considered to be one of the most livable countries in the whole world. However,
a lot of people don't know this, but our banks were positioned so well after 2008 that they bought a ton of American banks. And TD is a big one on the East Coast. They're one of the top banks.
Today, things don't look quite so rosy. The headline numbers are still pretty good. Canada's GDP has grown faster than basically any other G7 country, apart from the US since the pandemic. But scratch the surface, and it quickly becomes clear that Canada doesn't live up to its international reputation. Productivity is stagnant, GDP per capita is actually falling, and its public services are painfully strained.
Uh-oh, Trudeau. Uh-oh, Freeland. Maybe you should watch this so you understand how statistics work. So when you brag about us being the top in the G7 and the OECD and all of these made-up statistics that are easy to manipulate and hide.
So let's start by taking a look at the headline numbers. Like the rest of the world, Canada's economy has had a tough few years. Rising global food and energy prices pushed inflation up to a peak of 8.1% in June 2022, a level last reached during the oil price crisis of the late 70s and early 80s.
Can you guys think of anything else that increased food and energy prices in Canada? Perhaps the carbon tax. And a lot of people watching probably found me from the carbon tax stuff originally. Thank you for being here if you've been here that long. 35 cents a liter. Gas fluctuates. Yeah, I would love it to be 35 cents cheaper when it does fluctuate.
After the central bank raised its benchmark interest rate of 0.25% in 2022 to a high of 5% in late 2023, inflation fell relatively quickly, dropping to 3.4% in May of 2023 and then stabilizing around 3% from January 2024 onwards.
When they say inflation is down, that doesn't mean prices are down. Prices are still up. They just went down slower. They're talking about disinflation, not deflation, which we may see in Canada because of how bad things could go.
It was also low and stable enough that in June, Canada's central bank decided to cut rates, becoming the first G7 central bank to do so. What makes this look even more impressive is that Canada apparently continued to post relatively strong GDP growth during this steep rise in interest rates. At the same time as most of the global economy was stalled, Canada posted GDP growth of 3.8% in 2022 and 1.1% in 2023.
Have you liked the video yet? If you haven't, please do. It helps get the video out in front of more people, helps the channel grow. It's a free way to support. If you like what we talk about here and you want to hang out more with us, please hit the subscribe button. Love to have you on board. Back to the video.
Data from April also suggests that, in the first quarter of 2024, the Canadian economy grew by 1.7% year on year, below analysts' expectations of 2.2%, but well above basically every other G7 country apart from the US. Canada's apparent overperformance has drawn plaudits from international commentators. In June, the IMF praised Canada for achieving a so-called soft landing, i.e. bringing inflation down without incurring a recession. However, things don't look quite as good when you dig into the data. The main reason for this is that Canada's apparent growth has actually been driven by unprecedented amounts of immigration.
This is an international channel that has noticed that we have unprecedented amount of immigration in Canada currently. So if people at the international level are noticing that, how can Trudeau and Freeland, this is another YouTube channel, by the way, I'll link it down below. They post a lot of great stuff. It's called TLDR News. How can Chrystia Freeland and Trudeau not put this together? Oh yeah, because it works for their corporate buddies and it is a great way to pad and fake the numbers at the expense of Canadians. Course.
In the third quarter of 2023 alone, Canada took in something like 400,000 immigrants, including both permanent and temporary residents, representing roughly 1% of the pre-existing population. In percentage terms, this was the largest influx of people into Canada since the second quarter of 1957, when the country received tens of thousands of refugees fleeing from the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. This is largely a consequence of policy choices by the current government, which has deliberately liberalised migration rules and set targets for roughly 500,000 new permanent residents each year. This 1% increase was significantly larger than the growth that the Canadian economy experienced that quarter. In fact, it shrank by 0.1%, which means that GDP per capita actually fell. This will be fine.
Whoa. And then also the other thing is, he said that, progressive policies, they basically liberalized immigration and made it easier. So what happened was it is actually due to Jagmeet as well. I didn't realize it was such a big impact from him on the immigration level. But between when him and Trudeau formed their coalition, that allowed for them to basically slash all rules on immigration and pass everything through and made it way easier.
And if it was a one-off thing, but it's not. According to a study by the Fraser Institute, in 5 of the 6 quarters between the middle of 2022 and the end of 2023, Canada's population grew by more than its economy. While we don't have complete data for the first 2 quarters of 2024, the fact that growth has come in well below analysts' expectations suggests something similar happened then too. This means that even though Canada's GDP is rising, its GDP per capita is falling. In other words, the Canadian economy is in some sense getting bigger, but Canadian living standards are also actually falling.
To put this in perspective, this would be the same thing as, you make $5,000 a month and then you start spending an additional $500 a month on credit card and you go, oh yeah, my income's grown by $500 a month. And it's like, sure, but you're spending that on debt because that's essentially what's happening through this immigration.
In fact, according to that Fraser Institute study I mentioned a moment ago, GDP has declined from about $60,000 in the second quarter of 2022, when it peaked post-COVID, to about $58,000 in the fourth quarter of 2023, representing a decline of about 3.4%. This is pretty astonishing. Obviously, we generally expect that GDP per capita should increase over time, barring exceptional circumstances. But this means that Canada's GDP per capita has now fallen to below where it was in 2014.
What happened just after 2014 that changed Canada for the worse?
The steep rise in immigration has also made Canadians less positive about immigration, pushed up Canada's unemployment to a 2-year high of 6.4%, and exacerbated its housing crisis, which is one of the worst in the world.
Yep, worst in the world for housing crisis. And then on top of that, we are also seeing insolvencies in real estate companies and real estate developers, which we hadn't seen levels of since the 2008 crisis. Canada fared okay in the 2008 crisis, but the reason why that's such a big deal is that means less stuff will get built, which means there will be less units.
Average house price in Canada has skyrocketed from roughly $250,000 Canadian dollars in 2005 to about $750,000 today. And the ratio between median house price and median wage has risen from 3 in the 90s to nearly 6 today. On top of that, particularly popular cities like Vancouver and Toronto are literally some of the least affordable cities in the world, with the ratio
hell yeah, Canada topping charts,
reaching 12 in Vancouver and nearly 10 in Toronto. As we mentioned in other videos, housing crises are generally bad for economies. They exacerbate inequality, push down fertility rates, and even reduce productivity, i.e. GDP or output per hour of work.
All right, guys, serious talk for a couple things here. Obviously, he mentioned about the Canadians being concerned about immigration as it being one of our top concerns. 100%. But we do have lower fertility rates, and so Canada, of course, does need some level of immigration. Canadians watching this, have kids. If you're going to comment, it's too expensive, nobody can afford to have kids. How are all of the immigrants having kids, and how are they affording to have kids? You can do it. We can do it, Canadians. Start having kids. We can lower the immigration. That's the only way that these companies can stop getting away with it. If we're having kids, we can bring in reasonable amounts of immigrants. We can get the growth. We can get back on track.
This is largely because high house prices deny even diligent people the opportunity to work in highly productive areas. In Canada's case, that's cities like Calgary, Toronto, and Ottawa. This might be one of the main reasons that Canada also has a productivity crisis on its hands at the moment. In fact, Canada has seen almost zero productivity growth since 2015, and real wages have actually fallen. So
Could that be because now every company has seen that Trudeau and the Liberal government was more likely to punish you for success in Canada than they were to reward or encourage success? So companies stopped investing in equipment and other types of capital to increase our GDP, and then we cut down on our resources and our commodities at the altar of environment.
Neither Canada's productivity nor its GDP per capita are actually growing significantly. This means that Canada's GDP is only growing because of immigration and because Canadians are working longer hours. This is in part why, in April, the Trudeau government promised a wildly optimistic plan to build an extra 2 million units of housing by 2031.
Impossible.
Well short of the 3.5 million that academics think Canada needs to bring house prices down to their historical norm, but enough to put Canada's home-to-resident ratio on par with the rest of the G7. Unfortunately for Trudeau, though, so far house building rates haven't increased, and Canada is only on track to build about 200,000 new homes this year, well below the 550,000 required by Trudeau's new plan.
Housing starts are down.
Anyway, if this housing crisis isn't resolved, it could be really dangerous for the Canadian economy. Mortgages have pushed Canada's private debt level to about 200% of GDP, one of the highest in the world, and even higher than Japan before its massive real estate crash in the 90s. While their housing market has survived the recent rate hikes, largely thanks to new demand from recent immigrants, if it were to crash, it would push Canada into a Japan-style crisis, which could be disastrous.
Rates are coming down, and to be honest, it wouldn't be the worst thing if Canadian prices slowly grinded sideways and we allowed some incomes to catch up so we could make housing more affordable, and that way people could finally get into the market and feel more secure with their living scenario to have more kids. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you made it this far in the video, you absolutely rock. You're so good looking. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and have a great rest of your day.